October 1943, Black Thursday had shattered the 8th Air Force. The raid on Schweinfurt cost 60 bombers and 600 men. The survivors landed with holes in their wings and ice in their blood, but the war did not pause for grief. Replacement crews arrived daily, raw and green, to fill the empty bunks. Among them was radio operator Larry Goldstein, assigned to the 388th Bomb Group. His pilot, B.J. Kierstead, looked at the battered B-17 they called Worry Wart, a name painted nowhere, a joke about the co-pilot's nervousness, and told the crew chief, "We will be the crew that completes our 25 missions." Goldstein believed him. He had to. On November 13, a different kind of disaster struck. Bill Topping, a bombardier with the 44th Bomb Group, climbed into a brand new B-24 for his first mission to Bremen. The ground crew had issued him an electric flying suit, but the gloves were missing the clip that completed the circuit. Topping froze at 20,000 feet. His guns jammed in the cold over the target. Flak tore into the Liberator. Fighters finished the job shredding engines and controls. The pilot dove for Holland, crash-landed, and Topping found himself staring at German soldiers. "For you, the war is over," they said. He was a prisoner before his tour had even begun. That same December, a new sound entered the European sky. The P-51 Mustang, fitted with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, arrived in England. American test pilots had already confirmed it could outrun any German fighter and turn inside a Messerschmitt. On December 11, the 354th Fighter Group flew the Mustang's first combat mission, a shallow sweep over France. The German pilots barely noticed, but the Americans knew. The range of this plane changed everything. Soon the fighters would not just escort the bombers to the coast, they would follow them all the way to Berlin. On December 13, the 445th Bomb Group flew its first combat mission. Navigator Hal Terrell climbed aboard a B-24 named Liberty Bell. Their target, the submarine pens at Kiel. Over the North Sea, the Luftwaffe struck. Fighters dove from 12 o'clock high, closing at 500 miles per hour. Terrell watched American bombers explode, tumble, and fall. He saw P-38s shot down before they could help. On the bomb run, a green bombardier opened the bay doors too late, and their bombs plowed a farmer's field. That night, Terrell understood. The odds of surviving a full tour were 1 in 3. He did not know if he would be the one, January 1944. The command of the 8th Air Force passed from Ira Eaker to Jimmy Doolittle. It was a change driven by impatience and the terrible cost of the previous autumn. Doolittle arrived with a reputation for audacity, and he immediately understood something his predecessor had not. He saw that the fighters were not merely shields for the bombers. They were weapons of attack. The old policy was simple: stay close to the bombers, protect them at all costs. Doolittle tore up that rule book. He summoned General William Kepner, the head of Fighter Command, and ordered a sign removed from his wall. The sign read, "Our mission is to bring the bombers back." Doolittle told him, "Your mission is to destroy the German Air Force." In a single stroke, the fighters were unleashed. The 357th Fighter Group, still orienting to the English countryside, felt the shift in the air. Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Hayes, a veteran of the Pacific, understood the change was overdue. "We were still learning," he later recalled, "but up to March 6 we had 30 victories. On that day over Berlin, Hayes led his squadron into a swarm of over 100 German fighters. The score was 20 kills and no losses. They earned a Distinguished Unit Citation and from Lord Haw Haw's broadcasts, a lasting name, the Yoxford Boys. They were no longer tied to the bomber stream. They were hunters now. On February 8, the bombers struck Frankfurt. Among them was First Lieutenant Howard Snyder, piloting a B-17 of the 306th Bomb Group. The run was uneventful until the fighters arrived. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s came in fast from the rear, their 20mm cannon shells ripping through the fuselage. One shell hit the oxygen cylinders in the cockpit, and the escaping gas ignited. In an instant, the cockpit was a wall of fire. Snyder clawed at his safety belt, burned and dazed, and shouted for the crew to bail out. He followed them through the nose hatch, tumbling into the freezing air at 20,000 feet. He pulled the ripcord late, smashing into a tree in the Belgian countryside. Farmers found him hanging 20 feet up, injured but alive. They hid him from the patrols that hunted with dogs. That night, they lowered him from his perch, and Snyder began a 7-month journey as a fugitive, fighting alongside the Belgian resistance. Then came Big Week. On February 20, the 8th Air Force launched its most ambitious campaign yet. 29 bomb groups, over 880 bombers, lifted off into a gray English sky. Their target, the aircraft factories of the Third Reich. The weather was vile, heavy clouds and rain, but the order stood go. First Lieutenant Ralph Golubach was a co-pilot with the 44th Bomb Group, flying his first major missions. He watched a flash of light in the clouds as 2 planes collided and exploded. He wrestled his B-24 through the overcast, climbing blind until finally breaking into deep blue sky at 17,000 feet. The cold was numbing, 50 below zero, and the heaters did not work. The bombers fought through to the targets, hitting Leipzig, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt. The P-51s and P-47s tore into the German interceptors that rose to meet them. It was not a single victory, but a week-long beating. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of its most experienced pilots in those 6 days. By February 25, the climax arrived. The 8th Air Force struck again, and this time the Luftwaffe came up in force, defending the heart of Germany. The air over the factories filled with burning aircraft, falling bombers, and drifting parachutes. The Americans lost planes, but they kept coming. The German fighter arm was a professional force built on experienced leaders. Big Week gutted that leadership. Replacements could be trained for the planes, but the skill and judgment that took years to build were gone in an afternoon. It was a wound from which the Luftwaffe never fully recovered. The 8th Air Force proved it could sustain battle day after day. Before Big Week, such an effort would have left them crippled for weeks. Now they landed, refueled, rearmed, and flew again at dawn. The tide had turned. The Americans had the numbers, the machines, and now the doctrine to win the air war. On March 4, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first daylight raid on Berlin. The 95th Bomb Group led the way, but thick clouds scattered the formation. For the 388th Bomb Group, it was a different story. Radio operator Larry Goldstein climbed aboard Worry Wart for his 25th and final mission. His crew elected to fall out of formation and bomb a railroad yard in Germany. A Focke-Wulf 190 caught them alone, hammering the fuselage with 20mm shells before they dove into cloud cover and escaped. Worry Wart limped home on fumes, the brakes failing as they rolled to a stop in a plowed field. Goldstein climbed out and saw a hole in the radio room wall exactly where his head had been. He kissed the ground. His war was over. 2 days later, on March 6, the 8th Air Force returned to Berlin with over 600 bombers. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them in strength. Lieutenant Colonel Bob Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group led 8 P-47s on escort that morning. He saw a gaggle of aircraft approaching from the north and assumed they were American reinforcements. Then he recognized the silhouettes: Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s. Nearly 180 of them were bearing down on the bomber stream. Johnson had 8 planes against a swarm. He gave the order and opened fire. The sky over Berlin became a churning mass of burning metal and silk parachutes. Johnson's 8 Thunderbolts tore through the German formation, scattering fighters in all directions. Bombers fell with wings sheared off, flames trailing 2,000 feet. German pilots rammed American planes, some intentional, some the chaos of close-quarters combat. 69 bombers went down that day, but the Luftwaffe lost even more. Johnson landed with 1 man missing from his flight. At the bar in London that night, bomber crews bought the fighter pilots drinks. The new policy was working. The fighters were no longer chained to close escort, and the Germans were paying for every interception. 6 weeks later, on April 15, Major Joseph Bennett of the 56th Fighter Group climbed into his P-47 for a long mission over Germany. To stay comfortable during the 6-hour flight, he loosened his seatbelt, a small adjustment that would save his life. At 21,000 feet, his wingman drifted too close in the clouds. The wingtip struck Bennett's canopy and popped it clean off. Instinct took over. Bennett jammed the stick forward, but without the belt tight, he slipped upward. His fingers lost their grip on the control column, and the wind sucked him out of the cockpit. He fell through the cold air, unable to breathe, and pulled the ripcord with all his strength. The parachute opened with a violent jerk, and Bennett found himself drifting toward the English Channel. He hit the water, inflated his dinghy, and waited. Hours passed. A seagull pecked at his wounded nose. Finally, a British air sea rescue boat pulled him aboard. Wrapped in blankets and given hot buttered rum, Bennett drifted into sleep. He had cheated death once, but on May 25, during a mission over Germany, a young German pilot named Hubert Heckmann slid in behind Bennett's P-47. Before Heckmann could fire, his guns jammed and his Messerschmitt 109 struck Bennett's tail section, shearing it off. Bennett bailed out, landed near a farm, and was captured. His war ended in a prisoner of war camp. On May 12, 1944, a massive 8th Air Force bomber stream turned east toward Czechoslovakia. The target was the synthetic oil refinery at Brooks, a critical fuel source for the German war machine. Staff Sergeant Will Richardson, a ball turret gunner with the 94th Bomb Group, climbed into his cramped plexiglass sphere and checked his guns for the fourth time. Ahead of him, wave after wave of B-17s stretched across the sky, their silver fuselages glowing in the high-altitude sun. The formation crossed into German airspace and found no friendly fighter escort waiting for them. Then the Luftwaffe arrived. Yellow-nosed Focke-Wulf 190s from Goering's crack Abbeville group sliced through the bomber boxes, firing rockets and cannon shells. Richardson and the top turret gunner twisted their turrets constantly, tracking bandits at 10 o'clock, then 12 o'clock, then swinging aft to cover the tail. A 109 and a P-51 collided head-on directly in his field of view. There were no parachutes. An 88mm flak shell punched through the left wing, severing oil lines and forcing the crew to feather number 1 engine. Oxygen lines in the ball turret were severed, leaving Richardson to breathe thin air as the bomber dropped out of formation. For the next hour, he fired at every fighter that came within range, his guns barking until the ammunition ran low. The battered B-17 limped home on 2.5 engines, touching down at Bury St. Edmunds after more than 11 hours in the air. The crew had been listed as missing. They arrived in time to stop their personal belongings from being collected as salvage. 1 week later, on May 19, Richardson climbed back into his turret for another raid on Berlin. The formation was tight, the bomb ran straight and level. Above him, a B-17 called Miss Donna May drifted slightly out of position, sliding beneath the lead squadron. Richardson watched the bomber above release its load. One of the 1,000-pound bombs fell directly behind its number 3 engine, then tumbled downward. The bomb struck Miss Donna May's left stabilizer. The impact jammed the elevator in a full-down position. The stricken fortress nosed over instantly and began a steep dive. Richardson stared through his plexiglass, waiting for parachutes. None appeared. The aircraft broke apart as it fell, carrying its entire crew into the ground. There was nothing anyone could do. The bomb bay camera of the upper B-17, set to record damage on the target, captured the fatal accident on film. The formation held course and dropped its ordnance on Berlin. But for the men who saw it happen, the image of Miss Donna May breaking apart stayed with them for the rest of the war. Friendly fire, mechanical error, the chaos of 1,000 airplanes in a tight box. It did not matter. The crew was gone and no enemy had fired a shot. On May 29, First Lieutenant Ralph Golubach of the 44th Bomb Group prepared for his 30th and final combat mission. His B-24, a veteran aircraft that had carried 3 names over its service life, Prince Ass, Prince, and Princess, was loaded with radar jamming gear and 3 green crewmen flying their first sorties. The target was the synthetic oil refinery at Politz on the Baltic coast of Poland. The bomb run was smooth, the flak surprisingly inaccurate. Golubach watched the smoke rise from the target, then banked the Liberator north toward the Baltic Sea. Minutes later, a lone Messerschmitt 410 slashed through the formation, spraying cannon fire. The left wing took a direct hit. Fuel streamed from ruptured cells. Number 1 engine seized, and the windmilling propeller threatened to tear the aircraft apart. Golubach gave the order to lighten the ship. Ammunition, machine guns, and the precious Norden bomb sight went over the side. The crippled B-24 could not make England. Golubach set a course for neutral Sweden. German fighters approached, looked the wreck over, and turned away. There was no need to waste ammunition on a plane that was already finished. The bomber crossed the Swedish coast on fumes and put down on a grass field at Malmö. Swedish soldiers surrounded the plane. Gullibuck's war was over. He would spend the remaining months of the conflict as an interned guest, watching the news from a lakeside resort while his comrades continued to fight. On June 2, the crews of the 94th Bomb Group noticed something strange. The ground crews were painting bold black and white stripes on the wings and fuselages of every aircraft. 3 days later, on the evening of June 5, the briefing rooms filled with senior officers, far more brass than the airmen had ever seen in one place. The invasion of France was set for the next morning for the men of the 8th Air Force. The long months of strategic bombing had prepared them for this single day. Will Richardson took off before dawn on June 6, sitting in the tail of his B-17 with an Aldous lamp, flashing the group's identification letter to the planes forming up in the darkness. The bomber stream assembled and turned south across the English Channel. Below them, hundreds of ships stretched to the horizon. No German fighters rose to meet them. The Luftwaffe had been beaten so badly that only 2 enemy aircraft managed to penetrate the Allied fighter screen all day. Richardson flew 2 missions that day, bombing coastal defenses and then road junctions inland. The dominance of D-Day had not erased the cost of victory. On June 20, just 2 weeks after the beaches were secured, Lieutenant Colonel James Goodson, an ace with 15 victories and a veteran of the RAF's Eagle squadrons, led a strafing attack on a German airfield. His P-51 was hit by ground fire and he belly landed in a field. The Gestapo took him first, but he persuaded them to turn him over to the Luftwaffe. They handcuffed him and put him on a train to the interrogation center at Frankfurt. At noon, the train stopped in Berlin. Goodson recognized the station. He knew that 1,000 American bombers were scheduled to hit that exact rail yard at that exact hour. He took shelter in a German bunker. "I saw devastation 100 times worse than the London Blitz," he later recalled. "Digging women and babies out of the rubble we had caused was profoundly affecting. It was a view of the war that pilots rarely saw, not from 30,000 feet, but from the ground, standing among the people whose homes they had leveled." On June 22, the 8th Air Force attempted something bold. After bombing a synthetic oil refinery near Berlin, 2 wings of B-17s, roughly 73 aircraft, flew deep into Soviet territory and landed at the airfield at Poltava in Ukraine. The mission was a shuttle raid: bomb Germany, land in Russia, refuel, and hit German targets on the return leg. Colonel Archie Old led the 45th Bomb Wing into Poltava, his fuel tanks nearly dry. A German reconnaissance plane circled the field at 12,000 feet while the Americans were still taxiing. Old pointed it out to the Soviet base commander and requested permission to scramble the P-51s to shoot it down. The Russian general refused. That night, the Luftwaffe arrived. Pathfinder bombers dropped flares over the silver B-17s parked in neat rows on the open field. Then the bombers came in wave after wave, unopposed. Old stood at the edge of the runway and watched his aircraft burn. The Soviets had forbidden the American fighters from taking off. By dawn, 43 B-17s were destroyed and many more damaged. Of the 73 bombers that had landed, barely half a dozen were flyable. Old gathered the survivors and flew them to another base. The shuttle concept was abandoned. The lesson was harsh. Even with overwhelming air superiority, a single moment of political hesitation could undo months of effort. The 8th Air Force would carry the war to Germany from England, trusting no one but themselves. On July 13, Staff Sergeant Will Richardson climbed into his ball turret for a mission to Munich. Over the target, a 155mm flak shell punched through the plexiglass. The hole in the wing was small. The hole in his side was not. He stayed in the turret until the bombs fell away. Only then did he report to the pilot that he was hit. The left waist gunner took his place in the turret. Crewmates stripped off Richardson's flight clothes and wrapped him in an electric survival blanket. When fighters appeared, he grabbed the radio gun and fired one-handed while bleeding into his flight suit. The B-17 limped back to England over 3.5 hours. At the base, medics strapped him to a stretcher. His combat tour was finished. 1 week later, on July 20, the 8th Air Force lost its top scorer. Colonel Francis Gabreski of the 56th Fighter Group had 28 kills to his name. His bags were packed for rest and recreation in the States. but he saw a mission he wanted to fly. Over a German grass airfield, his propeller blade struck the ground as he strafed at low level. He belly landed in a meadow and was captured within days. The same week, the 8th Air Force tested a new role. Operation Cobra called for heavy bombers to blast a hole in the German lines near St. Lo. It was tactical support, not strategic bombing, something the heavyweights had never trained for. The plan called for bombing parallel to the front line, using a straight road as a marker. Instead, the air commanders insisted on a perpendicular approach, flying straight over the heads of American infantry. On July 24 and 25, over 1,500 bombers dropped their loads, but poor visibility and drifting smoke caused bombs to fall short of the German positions. American soldiers were killed, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking U.S. officer to die in combat. The cost was bitter, but the German line broke. Patton's Third Army poured through the gap, and the race across France began in earnest. On August 13, 2nd Lieutenant Erwin Stovroff climbed into his B-24 for what should have been his last mission. He had completed 34. The target was a road junction near Rouen, a choke point for German reinforcements. It was supposed to be a milk run. Stovroff's plane, Passion Pit, flew straight and level on the bomb run. The German 88mm guns were waiting. Flak smashed into both left engines and the wing caught fire. Stovroff toggled the bombs through the open bay doors and clipped on his chest chute. He jumped. The parachute opened, and he landed in the front lines among German soldiers. An officer looked at the prisoners standing near open graves and said, "No, we do not kill our prisoners. They were taken into captivity. Stovroff's war was over." They shipped him to the interrogation center at Frankfurt. Stovroff refused to talk. Then he noticed a gaunt man staring at him from across the room, deep sunk eyes, thin as a rail, a stranger. The man turned out to be his co-pilot's brother, Simon Monier, a West Point officer who had been parachuted into France to lead the Maquis. Two brothers, one camp. The war had given them one impossible reunion. The 8th Air Force that had been shattered at Schweinfurt in 1943 now ruled the skies over Europe. It had crippled the Luftwaffe before D-Day and then shifted to tactical support of the ground war. Snyder survived his 7-month evasion and was liberated. Richardson returned to the United States after his wounds healed. Gollebach was repatriated from Sweden. Stovroff endured captivity and came home. Joseph Bennett survived as a prisoner of war and was liberated in 1945. Tommy Hayes survived the war as one of the 357th Fighter Group's top scorers and returned to civilian life. Larry Goldstein found the quiet gratitude of a completed tour after Worry Wart carried him through 25 missions. Hal Terrell, haunted by the 1 in 3 odds, navigated his tour and made it home to the United States. Bob Johnson, one of the top aces in Europe with 27 kills, survived the war and returned home. The young men who climbed into aluminum fuselages and strapped on parachutes had changed the course of history. If you have family stories from this era, fathers, uncles, grandfathers who served in the air war over Europe, we would love to hear them in the comments below. We read everyone. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us continue telling these stories. Thank you for listening.